The morning mist of September 10th, 1813, hung low over Lake Erie's gray waters like a shroud waiting to be lifted. Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry stood on the deck of his flagship, the Lawrence, watching the horizon with eyes that had seen too much war for his 28 years. The silence was deceptive. Somewhere beyond that veil of fog lay the British fleet under Commander Robert Heriot Barclay, and today would determine who controlled the Great Lakes. Perry's hands gripped the ship's rail as he contemplated the monumental task before him. The War of 1812 had been raging for over a year, and the British had maintained naval supremacy on Lake Erie, effectively strangling American supply lines and troop movements. Fort Detroit had fallen, and the entire northwestern frontier trembled under the threat of British invasion supported by their Native American allies. The young nation's survival might well depend on what happened in the next few hours. The American fleet had been hastily constructed in the shipyards of Erie, Pennsylvania, where Perry had arrived in March to take command. Construction was being completed on a U.S. fleet. Command was given to 27-year-old Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry. His 9 vessels were a motley collection of converted merchantmen and purpose-built warships, crewed by a mixture of regular Navy sailors, militia volunteers, and even frontiersmen who had never seen salt water. Yet Perry had molded them into a fighting force through sheer determination and leadership. The British fleet, though smaller in number with only 6 vessels, boasted experienced sailors and superior firepower. Commander Barclay, a veteran of Trafalgar, commanded from his flagship HMS Detroit, a formidable vessel that had been constructed using materials salvaged from the American ship Adams. The British squadron included the Queen Charlotte, Lady Prevost, Hunter, Chippewa, and Little Belle, each manned by seasoned Royal Navy crews who had been fighting Napoleon's forces for years. As dawn broke across the lake, Perry's lookouts spotted the British squadron approaching from the northwest. The enemy had accepted his challenge at last. Perry had been blockading the British base at Amherstburg, cutting off their supplies and forcing them to fight or starve. Now, with provisions running low and winter approaching, Barclay had no choice but to engage the American fleet in open battle. The tension aboard the Lawrence was palpable as Perry's officers gathered for final orders. Lieutenant John Yarnall, the ship's first officer, checked his pocket watch nervously. Sailing Master William Taylor adjusted his spectacles and studied the approaching enemy through his telescope. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Usher Parsons, prepared his instruments below deck, knowing that within hours he would be treating wounds that would test his skills to their limits. Perry unfurled a blue banner that would become legendary, a flag bearing the dying words of Captain James Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship," the battle cry that had echoed through the corridors of the Navy Department in Washington would now flutter above the choppy waters of Lake Erie as the flag caught the morning breeze. Every man aboard the Lawrence understood that retreat was not an option. The British fleet began to form their line of battle, with HMS Detroit leading the way. Barclay's strategy was simple but effective: use his superior long-range guns to pummel the American vessels before they could close for decisive action. The Queen Charlotte took position astern of the Detroit, while the smaller vessels formed a protective screen. The morning sun glinted off the brass cannons that would soon thunder across the lake. Perry ordered his fleet to form line ahead, with the Lawrence leading the attack. The Niagara, under the command of Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott, would follow. In the line of battle, the smaller vessels Caledonia, Ariel, Scorpion, Somers, Porcupine, Tigress, and Trip would support the main action. As the two fleets maneuvered for position, the stage was set for a battle that would determine the fate of the war's northern theater. At 11:45 in the morning, the silence shattered like glass. HMS Detroit's long guns roared across the water, sending 24-pound iron balls screaming toward the American line. The Battle of Lake Erie had begun with a thunderclap that would echo across the nation and into the annals of naval history. Perry watched the splashes as British shot fell short of the Lawrence, but he knew the range was closing fast. His own guns, shorter in range but heavier in weight, remained silent as his ship pressed forward through the swells. The distance between the fleets narrowed with each passing minute. and the mathematical precision of naval warfare began to unfold with deadly efficiency. The second British salvo found its mark. A 24-pound ball crashed through the Lawrence's bulwarks, sending splinters of oak flying like daggers. Seaman David Bunnell screamed as a piece of wood tore through his shoulder, and the ship's surgeon was called to his first casualty of the day. The acrid smell of gunpowder began to mingle with the metallic scent of blood that would soon permeate every vessel on the lake. Commander Barclay's strategy was working perfectly. His long guns were methodically dismantling the American flagship. Before Perry could close to effective range, the Detroit's crew, many of whom had served under Lord Nelson at Trafalgar, worked their guns with mechanical precision. Load, aim, fire, the rhythm of naval combat that had made Britain mistress of the seas for over a century. But Perry had not come this far to be defeated by superior British seamanship. He ordered every scrap of canvas raised, driving the Lawrence forward into the teeth of the British fire, the American ship's carronades. Stubby cannons designed for close-range devastation would have their moment if Perry could just close the distance. The ship's carpenter, Joseph Roberts, worked frantically to plug shot holes as they appeared, his crew racing against time and rising water. The smaller American vessels began to engage the British line. The Scorpion and Ariel, though lightly armed, used their superior maneuverability to harass the enemy's flanks. Their commanders, Sailing Master Stephen Champlin and Lieutenant John Packet, had learned their trade in the cutthroat world of privateering, where audacity often mattered more than firepower. At 12:15, the Lawrence finally closed to effective range. Perry's carronades bellowed their defiance across the water, their 32-pound shots smashing into the Detroit's hull with devastating effect. The British flagship shuddered under the impact, and for the first time, British sailors began to fall in significant numbers. The battle had become a slugging match between the determined opponents. The Queen Charlotte, under Captain Robert Finnis, moved to support the Detroit, but found herself engaged by the American brig Caledonia, the smaller American vessel formerly a British merchant ship captured earlier in the war, fought with desperate courage against her more powerful opponent. Her commander, Lieutenant Daniel Turner, had served under Perry since the beginning of the campaign and was determined not to let his Commodore down. As the battle intensified, the human cost began to mount horrifically. The Lawrence's gun deck became a charnel house as British shot swept away entire gun crews. Perry himself had to close calls. One shot parted his hair, another tore his coat. Lieutenant Yarnell took a splinter in his leg but refused to leave his post. The ship's Marine detachment, led by Lieutenant John Brooks, kept up a steady fire from the fighting tops even as enemy marksmen picked them off one by one. The roar of cannon fire was now continuous, creating a wall of sound that could be heard for miles across the lake. Smoke from the guns began to obscure the battlefield, turning the bright September morning into a twilight world of muzzle flashes and screaming iron. The water around the fleets turned red as wounded men were carried below deck, their blood running through the scuppers. Perry's tactical plan was simple, but required perfect execution. While the Lawrence engaged the Detroit and Queen Charlotte, the Niagara would break through the British line and attack from the rear. But something had gone wrong. Elliott's ship remained frustratingly out of the main action, leaving the Lawrence to face the concentrated fire of the British fleet alone. Perry sent repeated signals for support, but the Niagara held her position. The British were beginning to sense victory. The Lawrence was being systematically destroyed, her masts shot away and her hull riddled with holes. Commander Barclay, though wounded by American fire, continued to direct the battle from the Detroit's quarterdeck. His years of experience in the Royal Navy had taught him that in naval combat, the side that maintained discipline and continued fighting longest usually prevailed. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the Lawrence had been transformed from a proud warship into a floating wreck. Her masts lay in splintered ruin across her deck, and her hull was so riddled with shot holes that only the desperate work of her carpenter and his crew kept her afloat. Of her 103 officers and men, 83 had been killed or wounded. The ship's guns fell silent one by one as their crews were swept away by enemy fire. Perry stood amid the carnage, his uniform torn and blackened by powder smoke. Around him lay the bodies of men who had followed him into battle with unwavering loyalty. Seaman Henry Lamb, who had served with Perry since the beginning of the war, had been cut nearly in half by a British shot. Marine Private James Bird lay dying in the cockpit, calling for his mother with his last breath. The sight of such suffering would haunt Perry for the rest of his life. The British fleet sensed victory within their grasp. HMS Detroit's crew cheered as they saw the American flagship's colors still flying but her guns silent. Commander Barclay, despite a severe arm wound, continued to direct the battle from his quarterdeck. The Queen Charlotte had moved closer to finish off the Lawrence, her guns loaded with grape shot to sweep the American deck clean of defenders. But Perry had not given up. In one of the most audacious moves in naval history, he made a decision that would turn the tide of battle. Gathering his battle flag and a handful of surviving officers, he ordered a small boat lowered under heavy fire. Perry transferred from the dying Lawrence to his second ship, the Niagara. The dangerous journey across the bullet-swept water took only minutes, but those minutes would change the course of American history. Lieutenant Elliott's failure to engage had left the Niagara relatively undamaged and with a fresh crew. Perry's arrival galvanized the ship's company, and within minutes, the Niagara was driving toward the British line with all sail set. The 28-year-old Commodore had turned defeat into opportunity through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. The British fleet, which had been concentrating their fire on the Lawrence, suddenly found themselves facing a new threat. The Niagara's fresh guns opened fire with devastating effect, catching the British vessels in a deadly crossfire. The Detroit, already battered by the Lawrence's earlier fire, shuddered under the impact of the Niagara's 32-pound shot. British Commander Barclay was so severely injured that he had to quit the deck and leave his ship in command of Lieutenant George Inglis. The Queen Charlotte, attempting to support the Detroit, found herself caught between the Niagara and the surviving American vessels. Captain Finnis fell dead on his quarterdeck, and his ship began to drift out of control. The smaller British vessels, Chippewa and Little Belt, tried to escape, but found themselves pursued by the American gunboats Scorpion and Trip. Perry's tactical genius was now fully displayed. He drove the Niagara directly through the British line, a maneuver that would have been impossible with the slower, more damaged Lawrence. The British ships, designed for line-of-battle fighting, could not bring their guns to bear effectively as the American brig passed between them. The Niagara's guns, loaded with double shot, swept the British decks with devastating effect. The psychological impact of Perry's bold maneuver was as important as its tactical success. The British sailors, who had been celebrating their apparent victory over the Lawrence, suddenly found themselves under attack from an unexpected quarter. The sight of the American Commodore's battle flag flying from a fresh ship sent a wave of dismay through the British ranks. Victory was slipping through their fingers at the moment they thought it was assured. The battle now became a melee, with ships from both fleets engaged in close-quarters combat. The Caledonia, previously engaged with the Queen Charlotte, found herself alongside the British brig Hunter. The two vessels poured broadsides into each other at point-blank range, their guns so close that muzzle flashes singed the enemy's rigging. The smaller American vessels, freed from the threat of the British flagship, swarmed around the remaining enemy ships like wolves around a wounded deer. As the afternoon wore on, the tide of battle turned decisively in favor of the Americans. The British fleet, which had seemed so confident in the morning, was now fighting for survival. The Detroit, her commander wounded and her crew decimated, began to signal for quarter. The Queen Charlotte, her steering gear shot away, collided with the Hunter, and both ships became entangled in a hopeless mass of rigging and spars. The smaller British vessels, seeing their flagship surrendering, began to strike their colors one by one. The Chippewa and Little Belt, attempting to escape to the north, were overtaken by the American gunboats and forced to surrender. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the entire British fleet had been captured or destroyed, an unprecedented victory. In naval history, the guns fell silent at 3:15 in the afternoon, leaving an eerie quiet that seemed to echo across the blood-stained waters of Lake Erie. The acrid smoke of battle drifted away on the September breeze, revealing a scene of devastation that would be remembered for generations. 6 British warships flew American colors, while the remnants of Perry's fleet gathered around their prize like victorious gladiators. In an aquatic arena, Perry stood on the quarterdeck of the Niagara, surveying the carnage with mixed emotions. Victory had come at a terrible cost. The Lawrence, his beloved flagship, wallowed in the water like a dying whale, her crew working desperately to keep her afloat. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Parsons, moved among the wounded with grim efficiency, his hands stained red with the blood of American heroes. The deck of the Lawrence was so slippery with blood that sand had to be spread to provide footing. For the survivors, the British fleet had suffered equally devastating losses. HMS Detroit's deck was carpeted with bodies, and her remaining crew worked in stunned silence to tend their wounded. Commander Barclay, his left arm shattered by American shot, was carried below deck where British and American surgeons worked side by side to save lives. The Queen Charlotte's captain, Robert Finnis, lay dead on his quarterdeck, his body covered by a British ensign. The human cost of the battle was staggering. The British lost 40 men, while American casualties were equally heavy. The Lawrence alone had lost 27 killed and 61 wounded, over 80% of her crew. The Niagara, despite her decisive role in the victory, had suffered only 2 killed and 25 wounded, a testament to Perry's tactical brilliance in switching ships at the crucial moment. Perry's first concern was for the wounded of both fleets. He ordered his surviving medical personnel to treat British and American casualties without distinction, a gesture that would be remembered long after the political issues of the war had been forgotten. The ship's chaplain, Reverend Thomas Breeze, moved among the dying men of both nations, offering comfort in their final moments. The surrender ceremonies were conducted with the dignity befitting such a hard-fought battle. Lieutenant George Inglis, who had taken command of the Detroit after Barclay's wounding, formally presented his sword to Perry. The young American Commodore accepted it with grave courtesy, then immediately returned it, a gesture of respect for a valiant opponent. Similar ceremonies were conducted aboard each captured vessel, with American officers treating their British counterparts with the honor due to worthy enemies. The logistics of handling 6 captured warships presented immediate challenges. Perry's surviving officers worked frantically to secure the prizes and tend to the wounded. The Caledonia, herself a former British vessel, was assigned to escort the captured Hunter back to American waters. The smaller vessels, Scorpion and Trip, took charge of the British gunboats Chippewa and Little Belt. The most dramatic moment came when Perry sat down in the cabin of the Lawrence to compose his victory dispatch to General William Henry Harrison. Using a crude table made from a barrel head, he wrote the words that would make him immortal: "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The simplicity of the message belied its enormous significance. For the first time in the war, an entire British fleet had been captured by American forces. News of the victory spread rapidly across the lake. American settlers, who had lived in terror of British raids, came out of hiding to celebrate. The Native American allies of the British, seeing their protectors defeated, began to reconsider their allegiances. The psychological impact of the victory was as important as its tactical significance. It proved that American forces could defeat the supposedly invincible Royal Navy. The captured British officers were treated with the courtesy due to prisoners of war. Commander Barclay, despite his wounds, was given the best quarters available and provided with medical care. His professional conduct during the battle had earned him the respect of his American captors. The British commander would later testify that he had never seen more determined fighting than that displayed by the American sailors. During the battle, the aftermath of the battle revealed the full extent of the carnage. The Lawrence was so badly damaged that she barely remained afloat. Her mainmast had been shot away, her hull was riddled with holes, and her deck was littered with debris and bloodstains. The ship's cat, which had somehow survived the battle, was found cowering in the hold. Traumatized by the noise and destruction, the British fleet, though captured, was in little better condition. The Detroit's hull was so damaged that it would require extensive repairs before she could be sailed to an American port. The Queen Charlotte had suffered structural damage from her collision with the Hunter, and both ships would need to be virtually rebuilt. The smaller vessels were in better condition, but all showed the scars of the fierce combat. As evening approached, Perry's fleet began the slow journey back to American waters. The wounded were transferred to the least damaged vessels, while prize crews took control of the captured British ships. The Victory flotilla stretched across the lake like a funeral procession, the damaged ships limping toward safety while their crews worked to keep them afloat. The sun set over Lake Erie on September 10, 1813, illuminating a scene that would be etched forever in American naval history. The battle was over, but its consequences would ripple across the continent and beyond, fundamentally altering the course of the War of 1812 and establishing the United States as a legitimate naval power. Perry's Victory dispatch reached General William Henry Harrison at his headquarters near Detroit. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, the aging general, who had been planning a defensive campaign against British forces, immediately reversed his strategy. The Victory secures control of the lake, forcing the British to abandon Fort Malden and retreat up the Thames River. Harrison's army pursues, decisively defeating the British and its allied Indian force at the Battle of the Thames. On October 5th, the news of the victory spread across the American frontier like wildfire. Settlers who had been fleeing British raids and Native American attacks suddenly found themselves on the offensive. The capture of the British fleet had severed the enemy's supply lines and left their forces on the Detroit frontier isolated and vulnerable. Within weeks, American forces had recaptured Detroit and begun pushing deeper into British-held territory. The psychological impact of the victory was equally profound. For 2 years, the Royal Navy had seemed invincible, its superiority taken for granted by both sides. Perry's triumph shattered that myth and gave Americans new confidence in their naval capabilities. The image of the young Commodore transferring his flag under fire became a symbol of American determination and resourcefulness. The captured British fleet was a prize of enormous value. The 6 vessels, once repaired, would significantly strengthen American naval forces on the Great Lakes. The Detroit, ironically built using materials from a captured American ship, would serve the United States Navy for the remainder of the war. The Queen Charlotte and the smaller vessels provided the foundation for continued American naval supremacy on Lake Erie. The human cost of the victory was soberly calculated in the days following the battle. American casualties totaled 27 killed and 96 wounded, while British losses were 41 killed and 94 wounded. These numbers, though significant, were considered acceptable given the strategic importance of the victory. The wounded were evacuated to hospitals in Erie, Pennsylvania, where they received the best medical care available. Perry's handling of British prisoners became a model for conduct in warfare. Despite the brutal nature of the battle, he ensured that captured officers were treated with dignity and that wounded enemies received medical care equal to that given to American sailors. Commander Barclay, despite his severe wounds, was provided with comfortable quarters and allowed to correspond with his family. This chivalrous behavior enhanced Perry's reputation and demonstrated American commitment to civilized warfare. The political ramifications of the victory extended far beyond the immediate military situation. News of the battle reached Washington, D.C., just as peace negotiations were beginning in Ghent, Belgium. The American delegation, led by John Quincy Adams, suddenly found themselves negotiating from a position of strength. The capture of an entire British fleet demonstrated that the United States could not be easily dismissed. As a naval power, British reaction to the defeat was one of shocked disbelief. The Royal Navy had not lost an entire fleet in battle since the days of the Spanish Armada. The Admiralty launched an immediate investigation into the circumstances of the defeat, eventually court-martialing several officers for their conduct during the battle. The loss of naval supremacy on Lake Erie forced a complete revision of British strategy. In the war's northern theater, the victory also had profound implications for Native American tribes allied with the British. The death of the Shawnee leader, Tecumseh, at the Battle of the Thames, which followed directly from Perry's naval victory, effectively ended organized Native American resistance in the Old Northwest. Tribes that had fought alongside the British found themselves abandoned and forced to negotiate separate peace treaties with the United States. Perry's fame spread rapidly throughout the United States and Europe. Artists created paintings of the battle, poets wrote verses celebrating the victory, and newspapers published detailed accounts of the engagement. The image of the young Commodore standing amid the wreckage of his flagship became an enduring symbol of American courage and determination. Congress voted Perry a gold medal, and several states awarded him land grants and other honors. The technical aspects of the victory were studied by naval experts on both sides of the Atlantic. Perry's decision to transfer his flag from the Lawrence to the Niagara became a textbook example of tactical flexibility and personal courage. The use of close-range carronades against British long guns demonstrated the importance of choosing the right weapons for specific tactical situations. The long-term consequences of the Battle of Lake Erie extended well beyond the War of 1812. American control of the Great Lakes became a permanent feature of the continental balance of power, influencing everything from westward expansion to the development of the American steel industry. The victory also established a tradition of American naval excellence that would continue through the Civil War and into the 20th century. The names of the men who fought at Lake Erie became immortalized in American naval tradition. Their stories passed down through generations of sailors who would follow in their wake. Perry's victory had created not just a strategic triumph, but a pantheon of heroes whose courage under fire would inspire future generations of American fighting men. Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry emerged from the battle as the nation's newest naval hero. His decision to transfer his flag from the Lawrence to the Niagara under heavy fire became the stuff of legend, demonstrating the kind of bold leadership that Americans expected from their naval officers. Perry's youth, he was only 28 at the time of the battle, made his achievement all the more remarkable. Here was proof that the young republic could produce leaders equal to any in the world. The story of Perry's transfer from the Lawrence to the Niagara was retold countless times. In the years following the battle, eyewitnesses describe how the young Commodore had gathered his battle flag and a handful of surviving officers before climbing down into a small boat under heavy fire from British marksmen. Perry had rowed across the blood-stained waters to reach the Niagara. One British officer later commented that it was the most audacious maneuver he had ever witnessed in his years of naval service. Lieutenant John Yarnall, the first officer of the Lawrence, became a hero in his own right. Despite being wounded 3 times during the battle, he had remained at his post, directing the ship's guns even as enemy fire swept the deck around him. When Perry left the Lawrence to transfer to the Niagara, Yarnall had continued to fight the damaged vessel until her guns were silenced. His courage under fire epitomized the fighting spirit of the American Navy. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Usher Parsons, had performed heroics of a different kind. Working in the Lawrence's cockpit below deck, he had treated wounded sailors from both fleets without regard for nationality. His medical journal, published after the war, provided a harrowing account of the battle's human cost. Dr. Parsons' compassionate treatment of wounded British sailors demonstrated that American victory need not come at the cost of humanity. The crew of the Lawrence had fought with a determination that bordered on the suicidal. Of the ship's complement of 103 officers and men, 83 had been killed or wounded, a casualty rate that would have caused many units to surrender. Yet the ship's colors had never been struck, and her guns had continued firing until the last possible moment. This kind of dedication to duty became a hallmark of American naval service. The British officers, despite their defeat, had earned the respect of their American opponents. Commander Robert Heriot Barclay, who had lost his left arm in the battle, was praised by Perry for his gallant conduct. Barclay's decision to fight against overwhelming odds rather than surrender his fleet without a battle demonstrated the professionalism that had made the Royal Navy feared around the world. His courage in the face of certain defeat earned him the admiration of friend and foe alike. The smaller vessels of both fleets had their own heroes. Sailing Master Stephen Champlain of the Scorpion had used his vessel's superior maneuverability to harass the British line, drawing fire away from the larger American ships. Lieutenant Daniel Turner of the Caledonia had engaged the much larger Queen Charlotte, in single combat, using superior seamanship to offset his disadvantage in firepower. These examples of individual courage and initiative became part of the Lake Erie legend. The battle also produced its share of controversy, particularly regarding the conduct of Lieutenant Jesse Duncan Elliott of the Niagara. Elliott's failure to engage the British fleet more aggressively during the first phase of the battle had left the Lawrence to face the concentrated fire of the enemy alone, while Elliott's supporters argued that he had been following orders to maintain his position in the line. Critics charged that his caution had needlessly prolonged the battle and increased American casualties. The controversy over Elliott's conduct would continue for decades after the war, with naval officers and historians debating the tactical decisions made during the battle. Perry himself, though privately critical of Elliott's performance, maintained public silence on the matter, believing that the victory was more important than individual blame. This magnanimous attitude further enhanced Perry's reputation as a leader who placed the service above personal considerations. The sailors who had fought at Lake Erie carried their experiences with them throughout their lives. Many would serve again in the Civil War, bringing the lessons learned on Lake Erie to new generations of naval officers. The battle had shown that American sailors could match the courage and skill of their British counterparts, given proper leadership and adequate equipment. This confidence would prove crucial in future conflicts. The technical innovations demonstrated during the battle also became part of naval legend. The use of close-range carronades against British long guns showed the importance of choosing the right weapons for specific tactical situations. Perry's decision to close with the enemy, despite taking heavy casualties, demonstrated that aggressive tactics could overcome apparent material disadvantages. These lessons would influence American naval doctrine for generations to come. The Battle of Lake Erie's influence extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory, fundamentally reshaping American naval doctrine and national identity. The engagement demonstrated that the young republic possessed not only the courage to challenge the world's greatest naval power, but also the tactical skill and technological capability to defeat it in open battle. Perry's triumph established principles that would guide American naval strategy for the next century. The concept of aggressive, close-quarters combat became embedded in American naval culture, emphasizing the importance of bold leadership and decisive action over defensive tactics. Future naval officers would study Perry's transfer from the Lawrence to the Niagara as an example of how personal courage and tactical flexibility could turn defeat into victory. The victory's impact on American morale cannot be overstated. For the first time since the Revolutionary War, American forces had achieved a clear, unambiguous victory over British regulars. The image of Perry standing amid the wreckage of his flagship, battle flag in hand, became a powerful symbol of American determination and resilience. The psychological victory was as important as the tactical triumph, proving to Americans and the world that the United States could compete with established powers. The strategic consequences of the battle reverberated throughout the War of 1812. American control of Lake Erie opened the door for the recapture of Detroit and the subsequent invasion of Canada. The Battle of the Thames, fought just weeks after Perry's victory, resulted in the death of Tecumseh and the collapse of the British Indian Alliance. These victories shifted the war's momentum decisively in favor of the United States. The technological lessons learned at Lake Erie influenced American naval development for decades. The effectiveness of carronades in close combat led to their widespread adoption in the American fleet. The importance of skilled seamanship in tactical maneuvering became a cornerstone of naval training. The battle also demonstrated the value of building ships specifically designed for Great Lakes warfare, leading to continued American naval supremacy in the region. Perry's victory had profound implications for American westward expansion. Control of the Great Lakes secured the Northwest Territory and opened vast areas for settlement. The defeat of Tecumseh's Confederation removed the major Native American obstacle to expansion, allowing American settlers to push west with greater confidence. The economic development of the Great Lakes region, which would later become the heart of American industry, was made possible by the naval victory at Lake Erie. The battle's influence on American naval education was equally significant. The Naval Academy at Annapolis, established in 1845, used the Battle of Lake Erie as a case study in tactical leadership and moral courage. Perry's example of transferring his flag under fire became a standard lesson in the importance of personal leadership in naval combat. The battle's emphasis on aggressive tactics and decisive action became hallmarks of American naval doctrine. The diplomatic impact of the victory extended to the peace negotiations at Ghent. The American delegation, strengthened by news of Perry's triumph, was able to negotiate from a position of relative strength. The treaty that ended the war in 1814 reflected the changed military balance, with Britain accepting American independence and territorial integrity. The victory had proven that the United States could defend itself against any aggressor. The human stories that emerged from the battle became part of American folklore. Tales of Perry's courage, Dr. Parsons' compassion, and the crew's dedication were riddled in countless books, articles, and speeches. These stories helped create a sense of national identity based on courage, determination, and sacrifice. The battle became a touchstone for American values, demonstrating that ordinary citizens could achieve extraordinary things when called upon to serve their country. The legacy of Lake Erie also influenced American naval architecture and shipbuilding. The lessons learned about the importance of maneuverability and firepower in lake warfare led to innovations in ship design. American naval architects developed new techniques for building vessels specifically suited to Great Lakes conditions, maintaining American naval supremacy in the region throughout the 19th century. The battle's commemoration became an important part of American naval tradition. Annual ceremonies at Put-in-Bay honored the memory of those who fought and died in the engagement. The Perry Monument, erected on South Bass Island, became a pilgrimage site for naval officers and patriotic Americans. These commemorations helped preserve the memory of the battle and its lessons for future generations. The international recognition of Perry's victory enhanced American prestige worldwide. European naval experts studied the battle's tactics and technology, acknowledging that the United States had achieved a legitimate naval victory against formidable opponents. This recognition helped establish America's reputation as a serious naval power, contributing to the nation's growing influence in international affairs. The Battle of Lake Erie thus became more than a tactical victory. It was a defining moment in American naval history that established precedents for courage, leadership, and aggressive tactics that would guide the U.S. Navy through future conflicts. The waters of Lake Erie had indeed run red with the blood of heroes, but from that sacrifice emerged a stronger nation and a naval tradition that would endure for generations. Perry's famous words, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," echoed not just across the lake that September day, but through the corridors of American history, reminding future generations that victory belongs to those bold enough to seize it.